In a sprawling, dimly lit mansion where whispers of fear and despair echoed through the halls, a cruel and twisted tradition was carried out every week. The Baron, a man whose wealth was rivaled only by his ruthlessness, had devised a sinister game that all his female slaves were forced to participate in. It wasn't a game of laughter or fun, it was a test of obedience, endurance, and survival, designed to break spirits and instill terror. Each week the women would gather, hearts pounding, unsure of what nightmare awaited them next. Rumors of the Baron's game spread among the servants and neighbors, yet no one dared intervene. Every session left scars, some visible, some hidden deep in the soul, marks of a cruelty that went beyond mere discipline. What drove the Baron to create such a twisted ritual, and what mysterious rules governed this weekly ordeal that none could escape? The grand hall of the Baron's mansion was a place where silence carried the weight of fear, and shadows seemed to twist into shapes of dread. Each week as the appointed hour approached, the female slaves would gather there, their footsteps hesitant, their bodies tense with anticipation of the unknown. The Baron's reputation for cruelty was well known, and yet every week the women were forced to assemble, compelled by a combination of strict orders and the subtle terror that he could inflict consequences far worse than anyone dared imagine. The air in the hall was thick with a mixture of dust, candle smoke, and the underlying anxiety of those who had come to dread this weekly ritual. As the slaves entered, they were acutely aware of each other's presence, their eyes darting nervously, silently assessing who might be favored, who might fail, and what horrors might await them this time. The Baron's entrance into the hall was always deliberate, almost ceremonial, his presence alone enough to make the women flinch. He would survey them with a cold, calculating gaze, noting expressions of fear, defiance, or desperation. His eyes seemed to pierce through the very fabric of their resolve, making them feel exposed in ways that went beyond physical vulnerability. The slaves would stand in trembling silence, forced into positions that left them uncomfortable, their posture a reflection of their anxiety. Some clutched at their skirts or shifted their weight nervously, trying to find even the smallest relief from the tension that gripped their bodies. Each week the hall seemed to contract, the walls pressing closer as though the very mansion conspired with the Baron to magnify the horror of the occasion. The weekly game itself was shrouded in mystery, and that uncertainty was one of the most terrifying aspects. No one knew exactly what the Baron would demand of them, and yet they all knew that disobedience or failure would be met with brutal punishment. Some speculated that the game was designed to test loyalty, others believed it was meant to humiliate and break the spirit of the women. Regardless of its purpose, the effect was unmistakable. Every slave entered the hall with dread in her heart, and left with a deeper understanding of the Baron's power. Whispers among the women hinted at the nature of past games, tales of strange rituals, public punishments, and psychological torment, but these stories did little to prepare anyone for what lay ahead. As the slaves awaited the beginning of the game, the Baron would often make them perform small tasks first, as a way to heighten their anxiety and assert his control. They might be ordered to kneel, to bow, to stand silently for long stretches of time, or to carry out trivial chores while under the watchful eyes of their fellow captive. These preliminary acts were deceptively simple, yet the underlying threat of punishment for even the smallest mistake created an atmosphere of constant tension. Every twitch, every whispered breath, every faltering step was scrutinized. The Baron seemed to relish the power he wielded in these moments, and the slaves felt the weight of his dominance pressing down on them like an invisible chain. The design of the hall itself contributed to the intensity of the experience. High ceilings amplified the echoes of footsteps and murmurs, while flickering candlelight cast shadows that danced across the faces of the assembled women, making them appear distorted and monstrous even to each other. The floors, polished but cold, seemed to sap the warmth from their bodies as they stood for long stretches. Windows were often shuttered, blocking the outside world and trapping the slaves in a space where the Baron's will reigned supreme. Every detail of the environment seemed calculated to increase discomfort and fear, to remind the women that they were completely at his mercy. Once the Baron signaled the start of the weekly game, the atmosphere, the tension that had been building reached a peak, and the women knew that their ability to survive the hour depended entirely on their obedience, quick thinking, and in some cases sheer luck. The game was not just a physical challenge, it demanded emotional resilience, the suppression of panic, and the capacity to read the Baron's moods with precision. Any misstep could result in immediate punishment, which ranged from verbal humiliation to more severe corporeal forms of discipline. The unpredictability of the tasks made it impossible for the slaves to prepare in advance, and the fear of the unknown became a constant companion, gnawing at their nerves with every passing minute. As the game progressed, the dynamic between the women became increasingly complex. Some tried to cooperate silently, forming unspoken alliances to navigate the challenges, while others became competitors, driven by the instinct to survive at all costs. Fear could twist into suspicion and rivalry, with every glance potentially signaling deceit or betrayal. The Baron seemed to understand this instinctively, and he used it to heighten the stakes, observing how fear could manipulate behavior, how it could fracture solidarity, and how it could push each individual to her limits. The end of the game each week was never celebrated. It was merely a temporary reprieve. The slaves left the hall physically and emotionally drained, their bodies sore, their minds burdened with anxiety for what would come the following week. The terror of the weekly assembly lingered long after the candles were extinguished and the doors locked behind them. The memory of standing in the hall waiting for the Baron's gaze, waiting for the signal to begin, and feeling the oppressive weight of expectation and threat stayed with them, shaping their behavior, their thoughts, and their very sense of self. Even outside the hall, the shadow of the weekly game loomed large. The women would whisper among themselves in hushed tones, sharing fragments of what had happened, offering warnings or advice, and seeking solace in small expressions of solidarity. Yet, no matter how much they tried to prepare for the next session, each week brought new horrors, new rules, and new challenges designed to test the limits of their endurance. The game became a cycle of fear and survival, an ever-present reminder of the Baron's control, and the Grand Hall itself became a symbol of the inescapable power he wielded over their lives. The psychological impact of the weekly gathering extended far beyond the immediate hours spent in the hall. The women learned to anticipate dread, to monitor their own reactions, and to conceal emotions that might be interpreted as weakness. The anticipation of the Baron's arrival, the uncertainty of the game's rules, and the constant threat of punishment, created a mental strain that was almost unbearable. Even in moments of rest, sleep was haunted by visions of the hall, the Baron's cold gaze, and the impossible tasks that awaited them. The memory of the hall, the weekly ritual, and the intense fear it invoked became a part of their very existence, shaping every decision, every glance, every breath they took. The Baron's weekly game was more than a mere exercise in cruelty. It was a mechanism for total domination. By compelling all his female slaves to gather in that hall, he not only enforced obedience but also instilled a pervasive atmosphere of terror that infiltrated every aspect of their lives. Each session left the women changed, reshaped by fear, and forced to confront their own limits and vulnerabilities. And as they waited for the next week, for the next iteration of the game, the Grand Hall remained etched in their minds as a place where survival depended on submission, and the ever-present hope that they might endure one more session under the Baron's ruthless control. The rules of the Baron's weekly game were as unpredictable as they were terrifying, and it was this very unpredictability that made the ritual so horrifying. Each week the female slaves would enter the Grand Hall with a mix of fear and trepidation, knowing that what awaited them could be entirely different from anything they had endured before. One week the Baron might demand a test of physical endurance, requiring the women to stand in strained positions for hours or to carry out impossible tasks, while under his watchful gaze. Another week the focus might shift to psychological torment, forcing the slaves to confront their deepest fears, or to compete in ways that exposed their vulnerabilities. No pattern could be discerned, no prior experience could offer true preparation, and it was precisely this chaos that kept the women in a constant state of anxious anticipation. The Baron's methods for changing the rules were subtle yet deeply unsettling. Sometimes he would announce the new rules in advance, but his instructions were often deliberately vague, leaving room for interpretation that could result in punishment if misjudged. Other times the rules would emerge gradually, as the game progressed, creating an environment in which the women had to constantly adapt, think quickly, and anticipate the Baron's expectation. Each task, each command, was designed to unsettle and confuse, breaking down the women's confidence and forcing them to rely entirely on his approval. The arbitrariness of the rules meant that the women could never truly master the game. Mastery was impossible, survival was the only attainable goal. The changing rules also ensured that fear remained an ever-present companion. No matter how familiar a week's format might seem, the women could never predict how the Baron would manipulate the structure, which rules would carry severe consequences, and which minor mistakes would be overlooked. Some rules tested patience and composure, such as standing perfectly still, or remaining silent for long periods, while others demanded cunning, observation or strategic thinking to avoid the Baron's wrath. Even minor miscalculations could result in humiliation or physical punishment, and the uncertainty of where the line would be drawn created a tension that gripped the women from the moment they entered the hall. The Baron seemed to take particular delight in exploiting this uncertainty, observing how fear affected each individual differently. Some slaves responded with extreme anxiety, trembling or faltering under the pressure, while others tried to mask their fear with stoicism or defiance. The Baron would adjust the rules accordingly, amplifying the difficulty or introducing sudden twists to test reactions. A seemingly simple command could become a trap, a test designed to reveal weakness or hesitation. The women soon learned that the game was not merely a performance to demonstrate obedience, it was a mechanism to expose every insecurity, every crack in their composure, and to force them to confront the unpredictable nature of his authority. Part of the terror of the changing rules lay in their seemingly arbitrary cruelty. One week, a mistake might lead to hours of public humiliation. Another week the same error could provoke physical punishment. There was no consistency, no fairness, no discernible logic, and this lack of predictability undermined any sense of safety. The women could not rely on past experiences to guide them. Every session demanded total vigilance, quick thinking and constant awareness of both the Baron's expectations and the reactions of their fellow slaves. Each rule carried an implicit threat, a reminder that disobedience or hesitation could have immediate consequences. The Baron's manipulation of the rules also played upon the competitive instincts among the slaves. By changing the objectives week after week, he encouraged rivalry, ensuring that each woman was focused not only on avoiding his punishment, but also on outperforming her peers. Simple tasks could be transformed into competitions of endurance, cunning or attention to detail, forcing the women to constantly gauge their own abilities against those of others. This environment of forced competition heightened stress and fear, as alliances were fragile and betrayals were always possible. The changing rules became a tool for psychological control, keeping the women divided, uncertain, and entirely dependent on the Baron's judgment. The nature of the tasks themselves was often as unsettling as the variability of the rules. One week the women might be required to complete strange and elaborate routines, precise in every gesture, as though performing an obscure ritual under scrutiny. Another week the focus might shift to endurance, requiring them to maintain balance, strength or composure under exhausting conditions. Occasionally the rules seemed nonsensical, deliberately designed to confuse or frustrate, leaving the women questioning their own perceptions and ability. This manipulation reinforced the Baron's dominance, creating a sense that the game was beyond human comprehension, and that survival depended on intuition, obedience and sometimes sheer luck. The unpredictability of the rules also allowed the Baron to exploit fear in subtle ways. He might introduce sudden punishments mid-task, observe reactions and adjust subsequent rules based on what he learned about each individual. This constant surveillance created a heightened state of anxiety in which the women were never allowed to relax, even for a moment. Every glance, every expression, every hesitation could be interpreted as defiance, fear or weakness, and the Baron's ability to read these signs allowed him to tailor the rules to maximize control. In this sense the game was never static. It evolved in real time, shaped by the responses of the women themselves, making the experience even more unpredictable and psychologically taxing. The changing rules also ensured that the women could never develop a sense of mastery or predictability. They might survive one week's game with apparent success, only to face an entirely new set of challenges the next. This relentless variability reinforced the idea that their existence within the Baron's control was inherently precarious. Each week became a test of adaptability, requiring not only obedience but also mental agility and the capacity to endure stress beyond ordinary limits. The women learned to anticipate uncertainty, to expect cruelty in unexpected forms, and to steel themselves for the unpredictable twists that the Baron might introduce at any moment. In addition to testing endurance and obedience, the shifting rules functioned as a tool for psychological domination. By controlling the environment, defining what was permissible, and constantly altering the expectations, the Baron created a system in which the women's thoughts, behaviors, and emotions were all subject to his authority. They were forced to question their own judgment, to doubt their abilities, and to rely entirely on his guidance for survival. The arbitrary nature of the rules eroded confidence and self-assurance, instilling a deep-seated anxiety that persisted even outside the hall, as each woman anticipated the next week's session and the new challenges it would bring. The weekly game with its mutable rules became a cycle of fear, adaptation, and endurance. The women learned that survival depended not on strength alone, but on their ability to navigate uncertainty, interpret the Baron's intentions, and maintain composure in the face of ever-changing demand. The unpredictability of the rules made each session uniquely harrowing, ensuring that the memory of the game remained vivid long after it ended. And though the women shared their experiences and warned each other of potential danger, no preparation could fully account for the constant evolution of the Baron's cruel and meticulous design. The weekly game imposed by the Baron was not simply a matter of physical endurance or obedience. It was a relentless test of the women's mental and emotional resilience, designed to push them beyond limits they had never imagined. Each slave quickly realized that survival depended on more than compliance. It required an intricate balance of fear, cunning,
and the ability to mask emotions that might be interpreted as weakness. The psychological pressure was constant, beginning from the moment the women were summoned to the grand hall, their minds already racing with anticipation, dread, and the unrelenting question of what new horrors awaited them. This mental strain was intensified by the Baron's meticulous observation. He watched, assessed, and adjusted, exploiting the slightest hesitation, the briefest flicker of doubt, and the subtle expressions that betrayed the women's inner turmoil. The Baron seemed to derive a cruel satisfaction from watching fear manifest in its most personal and vulnerable form. Some women trembled visibly, their bodies quivering as their minds raced to predict every possible command. Others maintained a facade of calm, suppressing trembling hands and shallow breaths. Yet the Baron's gaze would pierce through their composure, identifying fissures in their control. The game demanded constant mental alertness, a capacity to anticipate his expectations while concealing any indication of panic. Every glance exchanged with fellow slaves, every whispered movement, and every slight deviation from a commanded position could be interpreted as defiance or hesitation, and the consequences were immediate, and often severe. Isolation, even among the group, was another tool in the Baron's psychological arsenal. While the women were gathered together in the hall, the atmosphere was one of controlled tension rather than solidarity. Subtle divisions were encouraged, alliances tested, and rivalries fostered, often by the arbitrary nature of the Baron's rules. He might pit one woman against another, framing a task so that only one could succeed or survive a particular challenge. This manipulation forced the slaves to constantly navigate a precarious social landscape, weighing the benefits of cooperation against the risks of drawing attention to their own abilities or vulnerability. Fear of judgment, fear of reprisal, and fear of betrayal all intertwined, creating a psychological labyrinth from which there seemed no escape. The unpredictability of punishment compounded the psychological torment. Physical punishment was only one element. Verbal humiliation, public shaming, and subtle manipulations of trust were equally effective in undermining confidence. The Baron would often exploit the memories of past failures, reminding a woman of a mistake made weeks earlier, or use one woman's lapse to instill fear in another. The result was a continuous cycle of anxiety, guilt, and self-doubt that eroded the women's sense of security and autonomy. The mental toll was enormous. Even when the games ended for the week, the anticipation of the next session lingered, shaping every thought and influencing every interaction among the slaves. Cognitive strain was another hallmark of the Baron's design. Tasks were rarely straightforward. Instructions could be intentionally ambiguous, requiring the women to interpret meaning under extreme stress. A command that appeared simple on the surface might carry hidden layers of complexity, demanding careful observation, rapid decision-making, and an ability to read the Baron's subtle cues. Misinterpretation could result in immediate punishment, further intensifying the need for heightened attention and mental dexterity. Over time, the women developed acute observational skills, learning to anticipate mood shifts, recognize patterns in behavior, and strategize under pressure. Yet the constant evolution of the game ensured that true mastery was unattainable. The psychological endurance demanded by the Baron's weekly game extended into the personal sphere, forcing the women to confront fears they had previously buried. Some challenges required them to relive past traumas, face social humiliation, or perform tasks that tested moral boundaries. These trials were designed to fracture their sense of self, making the game not just a contest of obedience, but a systematic assault on identity and agency. Women learned to compartmentalize emotion, to detach from immediate responses, and to cultivate a mental resilience that was as exhausting as it was essential. Yet, despite these coping mechanisms, the lingering fear of the Baron's judgment maintained a constant psychological strain that infiltrated every moment of their lives within the mansion. The Baron also leveraged psychological games to reinforce his absolute control. He would often create scenarios in which success was possible only through complete submission, while failure could be punished in arbitrary and unpredictable ways. This manipulation of perceived choice heightened the sense of helplessness, as the women realized that no strategy, no alliance, and no display of cleverness could fully safeguard them from the whims of their act. The result was an environment in which the slaves' thoughts were perpetually occupied with vigilance, calculation, and anticipation, mental exertion that left them drained and anxious long before the physical demands of the game began. Fear was further intensified by the social dynamics of the group. The Baron's games often encouraged competition, forcing the women to observe each other closely, compare performances, and speculate on how the Baron might judge one's actions relative to another. Small gestures, unintended mistakes, or perceived advantages could become sources of tension, jealousy, or resentment. These dynamics fractured potential solidarity, ensuring that each woman felt both individually accountable and collectively vulnerable. Social pressure, combined with the Baron's unpredictable rules, created a psychological environment in which even minor lapses could feel catastrophic. Sleep deprivation, another subtle tool employed by the Baron, heightened the mental strain. Many tasks required prolonged periods of standing, kneeling, or performing under stressful conditions, often extending late into the night or beginning before dawn. Fatigue amplified fear and impaired judgment, making the women more susceptible to mistakes and easier to control. This exhaustion reinforced the psychological grip of the Baron's authority, as the women became increasingly dependent on mental discipline to maintain composure and navigate the challenges of each session. The psychological impact of the weekly game extended beyond the walls of the hall. The anticipation of each session, the memory of past humiliations, and the uncertainty of the Baron's intentions infiltrated every aspect of daily life. Simple tasks, interactions with other slaves, and moments of solitude were all colored by the fear that the next game would bring new horror. Even when the women attempted to find moments of reprieve, the mental weight of the Baron's control lingered, shaping thoughts, emotions, and behavior. Survival was not just a physical matter, it was a constant exercise in managing anxiety, controlling fear, and anticipating the unpredictable demands of a master whose cruelty knew no bounds. Over time, some of the women developed strategies to protect their mental state. They learned to anticipate patterns in the Baron's behavior, to cultivate a quiet resilience, and to support one another in subtle ways without drawing attention. Still, the ever-changing nature of the game and the Baron's acute awareness of psychological dynamics meant that no method of coping was foolproof. The mental endurance required to survive each week's game was as taxing, if not more so, than any physical challenge imposed. The psychological battle was ongoing, unrelenting, and inescapable, a defining feature of the Baron's method of control that left each woman continually aware of her vulnerability and the precariousness of her position.
The Baron's weekly game was designed not only to test obedience and endurance but also to instill deep, lasting scars, both physical and psychological, on the female slaves who were forced to participate. From the very first moment a woman stepped into the Grand Hall, it became evident that the experience would leave an indelible mark. The pain inflicted was not arbitrary. It was carefully calculated to reinforce the Baron's absolute control and to remind the women of their vulnerability, ensuring that the memory of the ordeal would linger long after the session had ended. Bruises, welts, and marks of punishment were often visible evidence of survival, but the invisible internalized effects, the erosion of confidence, the constant anxiety, and the shadow of fear were far more pervasive and enduring. Each week the physical challenges imposed by the Baron grew increasingly demanding, requiring the women to maintain uncomfortable positions, perform strenuous tasks, or endure prolonged periods of deprivation. The physical strain was compounded by the constant threat of punishment for the slightest misstep, creating a relentless cycle of tension and fatigue. Muscles ached, bodies trembled, and exhaustion set in quickly. Yet the women could not afford to falter. Every movement was scrutinized, every hesitation noted, and the knowledge that failure would result in pain kept them hyper-aware of their physical limitations. Some women developed visible signs of long-term stress, slightly hunched posture, teared eyes, and strained expressions, proof of the repeated toll the Baron's games took on their bodies. However, it was the psychological impact that proved the most profound and insidious. The Baron's methods of control relied heavily on fear and uncertainty. By changing the rules each week and introducing unexpected punishments, he ensured that the women could never feel secure or confident in their action. This constant state of vigilance created mental fatigue that was often more debilitating than the physical challenges themselves. The women learned to anticipate danger, to second-guess their instincts, and to suppress any natural response that might betray hesitation or fear. The result was a persistent anxiety that extended beyond the hall, permeating every aspect of their daily lives and shaping their behavior in ways they could not easily escape. Humiliation was another critical tool in the Baron's arsenal. Many of the punishments were public, performed in front of the other slaves to reinforce social hierarchies and demonstrate the consequences of failure. Verbal mockery, enforced kneeling, and other forms of degradation were used to assert dominance and break down individual dignity. The women quickly learned that survival required not only obedience but also the ability to endure shame and maintain composure under intense scrutiny. The social pressure of performing correctly in front of peers added an additional layer of psychological strain, as the women were constantly aware that their mistakes could damage not only their own standing but also their relationships with others in the group. In addition to visible scars and public humiliation, the Baron often employed subtler methods of punishment that left deep emotional wounds. Isolation, withdrawal of privileges, and the manipulation of trust were all strategies designed to make the women feel powerless and dependent on his approval. A woman might be singled out, forced to stand apart from the group, or denied food and comfort, creating a sense of vulnerability and reinforcing the notion that her survival depended entirely on the Baron's whim. These tactics instilled a persistent fear of abandonment and helplessness, leaving psychological marks that were difficult to measure but impossible to ignore. The combination of physical, emotional, and social pressures made the weekly game an all-encompassing ordeal. The women were subjected to a constant barrage of stressors, each reinforcing the Baron's control and each leaving its own mark. Over time, these experiences began to shape their identities, influencing how they moved, spoke, and interacted with others. Self-confidence eroded under the weight of repeated failure and punishment, and even moments of relative safety were tinged with apprehension. The cumulative effect of these weekly sessions was profound. The women carried with them the memory of pain, the anticipation of suffering, and the awareness that the Baron's influence extended far beyond the confines of the hall. The visible scars served as a constant reminder of past ordeals and as a warning to others. Some women bore bruises and cuts that were difficult to conceal, while others carried marks that could only be felt through tender muscle or aching joint. These physical reminders reinforced the memory of the game, making it impossible to forget the intensity and cruelty of the Baron's method. Yet perhaps more significant were the invisible scars, the internalized fear, the chronic anxiety, and the subtle shifts in behavior that signaled the psychological cost of repeated subjugation. These marks were less obvious to the casual observer but shaped the women's thoughts, reactions, and sense of self in profound ways. The Baron understood the power of these lasting effects and used them strategically. By ensuring that the women left the hall each week altered in body and mind, he created a cycle of fear that extended beyond the immediate session. The anticipation of the next game, combined with the lingering memory of past suffering, created a state of near constant vigilance and stress. Women learned to internalize the rules, to anticipate punishment even before it occurred, and to constantly monitor both themselves and their peers. This psychological conditioning reinforced the Baron's dominance and ensured that the women's loyalty, submission, and caution were maintained through a combination of fear, trauma, and learned helplessness. The cumulative nature of the scars also served as a form of social control. Women who displayed resilience or strength were observed closely, as the Baron sought to break those who might challenge his authority. Conversely, those who struggled were often subjected to harsher punishments, reinforcing the lesson that survival required conformity and submission. This dynamic created an environment in which every participant was acutely aware of her own vulnerabilities and those of others, further amplifying the psychological tension and ensuring that the impact of the weekly game extended beyond the individual to affect the entire group. Over time, the women began to adapt, developing strategies to cope with both the physical and psychological strain. Some learned to mask their fear with outward composure, while others relied on quiet observation and subtle alliances to navigate the challenge. Yet even these coping mechanisms could not fully erase the impact of the Baron's cruelty. Each week brought new challenges, new punishments, and new reminders of their own vulnerability, ensuring that the scars, visible, hidden, and psychological, remained fresh and persistent. The memory of past games, the anticipation of future ones, and the ongoing presence of the Baron's authority created a continuous, inescapable cycle of trauma and endurance that defined the lives of the women under his control. The Baron's perverse enjoyment of watching his female slaves compete against one another was a central element of the weekly game, a psychological manipulation designed to amplify fear, rival, and submission. From the moment the women were assembled in the Grand Hall, the Baron created an atmosphere that encouraged constant comparison, competition, and subtle jealousy. He understood that by pitting the women against one another he could magnify their anxiety, erode solidarity, and deepen the psychological grip he held over them. No act of cruelty or punishment was more effective than seeing one's peers suffer or falter, as it served as a constant reminder that survival depended not only on obedience to the Baron but also on outmaneuvering those around them. The competitions were never straightforward or predictable. Sometimes the Baron would assign tasks that required cooperation but secretly allowed only a few to succeed. Other times he would create direct challenges, forcing the women to perform physical feats, solve complex tasks, or endure mental strain in ways that made failure almost inevitable for some. The women quickly learned that their survival often required not just adherence to the Baron's commands, but also an acute awareness of the capabilities, weaknesses, and strategies of their fellow slaves. A misstep could mean personal punishment, while a moment of triumph could attract the Baron's scrutiny or envy, ensuring that every action carried a weight of consequence. The Baron's pleasure in observing these competitions extended beyond the physical aspects of the game. He seemed especially fascinated by the psychological reactions of the women, how fear, jealousy, and ambition could shape behavior under extreme stress. He would watch as a woman faltered under pressure, her eyes darting nervously to see if others had noticed, her body trembling as she tried to recover composure. The subtle movements of hands, shifts in posture, or the hesitation before responding to a command, could all become points of observation, guiding the Baron's decisions in real time and amplifying the tension within the group. In this way, the competition was as much a game of perception and manipulation as it was of endurance or skill. Rivalries inevitably formed as the women sought to navigate this high-stakes environment.
Those who demonstrated strength, cunning or composure became both models to emulate and threats to monitor. Some women attempted to form alliances, quietly supporting one another or signaling subtle strategies to share the burden of the challenge. Others became more self-serving, focusing on individual survival at the expense of peers, willing to capitalize on another's weakness if it increased their own chances of avoiding punishment. The Baron's carefully constructed environment ensured that every interaction carried significance, and the constant negotiation between trust, fear and strategy became an exhausting mental burden. The competitive structure of the games also allowed the Baron to exploit the human instinct for comparison. By creating scenarios in which only a select few could excel, he encouraged self-doubt and anxiety among the rest. Women who were successful one week might find themselves punished the next, their prior success interpreted as arrogance or a threat. Conversely, those who struggled initially could be manipulated into attempting riskier strategies to prove themselves, often resulting in further mistakes or humiliation. This dynamic reinforced the Baron's control by ensuring that the women were perpetually unsure of their standing, unable to predict how their performance would be received, and dependent on constant vigilance and mental adaptability. The Baron's observation of these competitions extended to subtle manipulations of behavior. He would sometimes provide praise, attention, or minor privileges to one woman while withholding them from others, creating an environment of constant evaluation and expectation. Even the smallest gestures, a nod, a glance, or a brief word of acknowledgement could trigger waves of anxiety, hope, or jealousy, reshaping the social dynamics within the group. The women learned that their emotional responses were as significant as their physical performance, and that mastering the social cues of the Baron was as crucial as completing the tasks themselves. The design of the competitions often forced women into morally ambiguous situations, testing their willingness to prioritize self-preservation over empathy or solidarity. They might be required to make choices that disadvantage peers, risk exposure of secret alliances, or compete directly for scarce resources or reward. These scenarios created ethical dilemmas that compounded the psychological pressure. As each woman had to weigh immediate survival against potential future consequence, the Baron seemed to revel in observing these choices, noting who displayed ruthlessness, cunning, or hesitation, and using these insights to shape future games. The cumulative effect of these competitions was profound. The women were subjected to constant observation, judgment, and comparison, creating an environment of perpetual stress. Friendships were tested, trust was fragile, and even minor errors could have cascading consequences. The Baron's strategic use of competition amplified fear, reinforced obedience, and deepened the psychological scars of each participant. Survival was no longer a matter of physical endurance alone. It required emotional intelligence, adaptability, and the ability to navigate a web of social dynamics designed to destabilize and control. Over time, the women developed intricate mental strategies to cope with the Baron's manipulation. Some focused on remaining inconspicuous, avoiding both attention and competition, while others sought to identify patterns in the Baron's behavior, anticipating which actions would be rewarded or punished. Yet no strategy could fully guarantee safety, as the Baron constantly altered conditions, introduced new rules, and manipulated perceptions to maintain unpredictability. The ever-present competition ensured that no one could relax or grow complacent, and the mental toll of constantly monitoring oneself and others became as exhausting as the physical demands of the games themselves. The Baron's enjoyment of these competitions was evident not only in his attention to detail but also in the emotional reactions they elicited. He seemed attuned to subtle signs of fear, jealousy, and triumph, responding in ways that heightened the stakes for everyone involved. A whispered comment, a fleeting expression, or a brief act of hesitation could all become points of focus, influencing his decisions and altering the course of the game. The women learned that even the most private or subtle reactions could have significant consequences, reinforcing the pervasive sense of surveillance and control. The competitive aspect of the weekly games also served a strategic function beyond immediate psychological impact. By fostering rivalry and division among the slaves, the Baron ensured that collective resistance or solidarity was unlikely. The women were so focused on navigating individual challenges, monitoring each other, and anticipating punishment, that the possibility of coordinated defiance became nearly impossible. The Baron's genius lay in his understanding of human nature. He knew that fear, rivalry, and self-interest could be leveraged as tools of domination, and the weekly games provided the perfect environment to exploit these instincts fully. In essence, the Baron's method of using competition as a tool of control created a complex psychological ecosystem in which fear, observation, and rivalry were intertwined. The women were not only challenged physically and mentally but also socially and emotionally, their every action scrutinized and every response manipulated. The result was a perpetual state of tension, mistrust, and anxiety, with survival dependent not only on obedience to the Baron but also on the ability to navigate the unpredictable social dynamics he engineered. Each week reinforced the same lessons: that the Baron's power was absolute, that survival required vigilance and cunning, and that the psychological consequences of the game extended far beyond the hall, shaping behavior, relationships and self-perception in ways that would linger indefinitely. The tasks imposed during the Baron's weekly game were often elaborate and seemingly without practical purpose, yet they were meticulously designed to challenge, confuse and humiliate the female slaves under his control. From the perspective of an outsider, these activities might have appeared arbitrary or even nonsensical, but for the women forced to participate, every task carried the weight of survival and the constant threat of punishment. The Baron's creativity in devising these tasks was as disturbing as it was precise, blending physical endurance, mental acuity and psychological manipulation into experiences that tested every aspect of the women's capacities. The result was a ritual in which obedience alone was rarely sufficient, and survival depended on a combination of intuition, observation and adaptability. Some tasks were physically demanding, requiring the women to maintain strained or unnatural positions for long periods, perform intricate movements with exacting precision, or carry out repetitive actions until exhaustion set in. The physical strain was compounded by the psychological pressure of knowing that even a minor mistake could provoke punishment, sometimes immediate, sometimes delayed, but always certain to leave a mark. The women learned to endure discomfort, suppress natural reflexes, and push the limits of their stamina, all under the Baron's cold, unyielding scrutiny. These exercises were rarely straightforward. They were layered with complexity and designed to test not only strength but focus, composure and attention to detail. Other tasks emphasized mental challenges and psychological endurance. The Baron often devised puzzles, memory tests or problem-solving exercises that were intentionally ambiguous or layered with multiple interpretations. The women were forced to make decisions quickly, to anticipate the Baron's expectations, and to interpret instructions that might have multiple or hidden meanings. Mistakes could be punished as harshly as outright defiance, and the cognitive load of constantly deciphering ambiguous commands added another dimension to the stress and fatigue. The women were compelled to maintain sharp mental focus, balancing the need for precision with the awareness that any misjudgment could have severe consequences. Humiliation was also a core component of many tasks. Some required the women to perform actions that drew attention to their vulnerability or to the perceived inadequacy of their abilities. They might be made to repeat tasks slowly or publicly while others observed, creating a dynamic in which failure was magnified and self-consciousness intensified. The Baron often exploited the reactions of other slaves, encouraging ridicule, judgment or subtle competition to amplify the psychological pressure. The resulting tension ensured that the women were never only contending with the task itself, but also navigating the social implications of performance, comparing themselves to peers and constantly fearing judgment. Some tasks seemed almost ritualistic in nature, incorporating elaborate gestures, movements or sequences that appeared to lack practical significance. The purpose of these exercises was not efficiency or utility but rather to test obedience, precision and ability to endure scrutiny without question. Deviations, no matter how small, were noted and punished, reinforcing the Baron's absolute control. The women quickly learned that the appearance of perfection was often as critical as the completion of the task itself. As the Baron evaluated not only results but demeanor, posture and composure, the unpredictability of the tasks added another layer of stress. One week might involve simple physical endurance, the next intricate mentally taxing exercises with bizarre or seemingly arbitrary rules. This variability prevented the women from developing confidence or routines, ensuring that every session felt fresh, challenging and fraught with anxiety. The inability to predict the nature or difficulty of the task heightened fear and uncertainty, making the Baron's control all-encompassing. The women learned that each week required full attention, adaptability and an acute awareness of both the explicit instructions and the subtle signals of their master's expectation. Many of the Baron's tasks also incorporated elements that tested moral boundaries, forcing the women to confront ethical dilemmas or to act in ways that challenged their personal principles. They might be required to prioritize self-preservation over cooperation, make choices that exposed others to risk, or perform actions that invoked feelings of guilt or shame. These exercises created internal conflict, as the women had to reconcile the instinct to survive with their conscience, often under the watchful gaze of the Baron. The resulting psychological tension reinforced obedience and submission while simultaneously creating lasting emotional scars. The Baron also understood the power of unpredictability and heightening stress. Even when tasks seemed simple or repetitive, minor changes in timing, sequence or rules could transform a familiar exercise into a challenge fraught with uncertainty. The women were forced to remain vigilant, constantly monitoring both their own actions and the reactions of their peers. Small errors could trigger immediate correction or punishment, reinforcing the lesson that no amount of preparation or prior experience could guarantee success. This manipulation of expectation and control was a hallmark of the Baron's cruelty, ensuring that the women's focus was consumed by fear, calculation and the relentless drive to survive. Social dynamics played an essential role in the execution of these tasks. The Baron often required the women to perform in the presence of each other, turning their individual struggles into a spectacle of observation and judgment. Rivalries emerged naturally as the women were forced to compare performances, assess the capabilities of peers, and anticipate the Baron's shifting preferences. Alliances formed, shifted, and dissolved based on circumstance, yet trust was fragile as the Baron's interventions could punish collaboration or favor self-interest at any moment. These social pressures intensified the psychological weight of the tasks, as the women navigated both the explicit challenges imposed by the Baron and the implicit challenges of interacting with others under extreme duress. Even minor successes were fraught with tension. The Baron might acknowledge achievement with subtle approval, only to introduce a new, more demanding challenge immediately afterward. The fleeting nature of success ensured that the women remained perpetually vigilant and anxious, knowing that any lapse could undo their effort. This cycle of brief triumph and sudden adversity reinforced the precariousness of their position, making each task not only a challenge to be completed but a test of endurance against the cumulative weight of fear, expectation, and social complexity. The Baron's bizarre tasks were ultimately a tool of control. Each exercise, no matter how convoluted or seemingly purposeless, was designed to break down the women's confidence, heighten anxiety, and reinforce the sense that survival depended entirely on obedience, adaptability, and ability to read the Baron's intention. The women quickly internalized the lesson that mastery was impossible, that predictability was an illusion, and that their safety required constant vigilance, mental agility, and physical endurance. The weekly tasks, layered with physical, mental, and psychological complexity, became a crucible in which the women were tested repeatedly, leaving scars that were as much emotional and social as they were physical.
The Baron's obsession with control and domination was evident in every facet of the weekly game. Yet whispers among the female slaves suggested there was an even deeper hidden motive behind his cruel rituals. It was as if the Baron's fascination with fear and obedience extended beyond mere sadism, reaching into the realm of obsession and power that was impossible for anyone outside his inner circle to fully understand. Some speculated that the weekly games were a form of study, a way for the Baron to observe human behavior under extreme stress, to experiment with obedience, fear, and psychological manipulation. Others believed that the games satisfied some darker private desire, an unspoken fantasy that could only be realized through total control of the women under his roof. Whatever the truth, the rumors of hidden purpose only added to the tension and uncertainty, as the women never knew whether they were performing for immediate survival or being tested for some larger, more sinister objective. The Baron's motivations were never explicitly stated, and this ambiguity became a central element of the psychological terror he imposed. The women could speculate endlessly, analyzing every word, gesture, and command for clues, but certainty remained elusive. The notion that there might be a secret purpose behind each game intensified the stakes, as each action could carry implications beyond the obvious. Was failure a lesson in humility, or a step in a broader experiment of control? Were minor successes rewarded simply to manipulate behavior or to set a baseline for future trials? This ambiguity created a pervasive sense of unease, ensuring that the women's minds were as engaged and strained as their bodies, constantly attempting to interpret the Baron's intention. Some of the more perceptive slaves began to notice patterns, subtle consistencies that hinted at underlying goals behind the seemingly arbitrary tasks. For instance, the Baron often observed not just performance but the emotional and social reactions of the women, noting how fear, rivalry, and alliances influenced behavior. These observations suggested that the games were a methodical study in human psychology, a controlled environment in which he could manipulate variables and assess outcomes. The women realized that their survival was not merely a matter of physical endurance or compliance, but also depended on understanding the Baron's motives, reading his intentions, and predicting his next move. The notion of hidden motives also fostered a sense of paranoia among the women. They began to scrutinize not only their own actions but also those of their peers, wondering whether certain behaviors were being evaluated for reasons beyond immediate punishment or reward. Was a fellow slave's success a genuine achievement, or part of a calculated test to provoke jealousy, rivalry, or emotional vulnerability? The uncertainty of the Baron's intentions created an environment in which trust became fragile, alliances were tenuous, and every interaction carried potential risk. The women's psychological burden was compounded by the constant need to interpret both overt commands and subtle signals, a task made all the more difficult by the Baron's unpredictable behavior. In some cases, the Baron appeared to use the hidden motives as a means of further exerting control. By suggesting either overtly or subtly that there was a larger purpose to the weekly games, he ensured that the women remained engaged, questioning, and vigilant at all times. The possibility that their performance had significance beyond the immediate moment kept them mentally and emotionally tethered to his expectations, reinforcing his dominance over not just their actions but their thoughts and perception. The women quickly learned that speculation was unavoidable, that understanding or guessing the Baron's intent was a survival skill, and that failure to consider these hidden motives could be as dangerous as failing the tasks themselves. The psychological impact of believing in a hidden purpose was profound. The women internalized the idea that nothing was random, that every word, gesture, and command could carry layered meanings, and that each session was a test not only of obedience but of insight, intelligence, and emotional fortitude. This awareness intensified the mental strain of the games, as they became exercises in constant calculation, observation, and self-regulation. The Baron's control extended beyond physical space and time, infiltrating the women's thoughts and influencing their behavior even in moments when they were not actively participating in the tasks. The hidden motive, real or imagined, transformed fear into a multi-dimensional force, affecting body, mind, and social interactions simultaneously. The rumors among the women about the Baron's motives ranged from the plausible to the fantastical. Some speculated that he was attempting to train the women into perfect obedience, molding them into ideal servants or companions whose every action conformed to his desires. Others whispered that the games were designed to study resilience and psychological endurance, perhaps for personal amusement or even for some scientific curiosity. Still others feared that the Baron's motives were far darker, tied to obsession, sadism, or the exertion of absolute power over human will. These speculatives, whether accurate or not, contributed to a heightened state of vigilance and anxiety as the women understood that their survival might depend on interpreting motives that were intentionally opaque. The Baron's manipulation of perceived hidden motives also served to deepen social dynamics among the slaves. Women speculated not only about the Baron's intentions but also about each other's interpretations, creating layers of intrigue, mistrust, and cautious observation. Alliances were tested and recalibrated as the women tried to gauge which peers might be favored, which could be relied upon, and which posed risks in a system where perception was as important as action. The interplay of fear, rivalry, and speculation ensured that the weekly games were as much about social navigation as about physical or mental challenges, reinforcing the Baron's dominance across every facet of their lives. The Baron occasionally reinforced these hidden motives through subtle cues. A particular gesture, the tone of his voice, or a fleeting expression could hint at a broader goal or a secret assessment, prompting the women to adjust their behavior in real time. The slightest shift could indicate approval, warning, or hidden expectations, and the women quickly learned to scrutinize these signals for survival. The mental energy expended in decoding these cues became immense, as failure to interpret a subtle message could result in punishment or missed opportunities for lenience. In this way, the Baron maintained a psychological control that was both intricate and unrelenting, extending beyond immediate observation into a constant awareness of his influence. Over time, some women attempted to develop strategies to cope with the uncertainty of hidden motive. They observed patterns, compared past sessions, and sought to anticipate how their actions might be interpreted. Yet the Baron's ingenuity ensured that no strategy was foolproof. Each session brought new twists, unexpected rules, or altered objectives that undermined prior assumptions. The women's efforts to decode meaning became a mental exercise fraught with both necessity and danger, reinforcing the notion that survival required not only physical and mental skill, but also an acute sensitivity to the enigmatic psychology of their captor. The hidden motives also magnified the sense of powerlessness. Even those who excelled in tasks or demonstrated exceptional endurance could not claim safety, as the Baron's assessments appeared to transcend immediate performance. Success could be interpreted as arrogance, failure as weakness, and minor actions could have consequences far beyond the apparent stakes. This created a pervasive sense of vulnerability, a psychological tension in which the women were never truly secure, and in which every action was weighted with potential consequence. The Baron's games thus operated on multiple levels, shaping behavior, inducing fear, and reinforcing absolute control through the persistent suggestion of unseen intentions. Ultimately, the speculation surrounding the Baron's hidden motives became an inseparable part of the weekly game. The women were compelled to perform not only for survival but also to navigate the opaque psychology of their captor, to anticipate the unseen, and to adapt continuously to a system designed to test every dimension of obedience, endurance, and perception. The combination of fear, uncertainty, and the belief in hidden purpose created a complex psychological environment, one in which survival depended as much on mental acuity and social awareness as on physical capability, and in which the Baron's control extended far beyond the visible confines of the Grand Hall. The Baron's games were notorious not only for their cruelty, but for the way they exploited every facet of human behavior, blending physical endurance, mental strain, social manipulation, and psychological terror into a seamless system of control. Each week the female slaves entered the Grand Hall knowing that the challenges would be unlike anything they had faced before. The Baron's methods were insidious. He combined arbitrary rules,
sudden punishments and constant surveillance to create an environment in which fear was omnipresent and control was absolute. The women quickly learned that survival depended on adaptability, vigilance, and the ability to manage both physical performance and emotional responses under relentless pressure. Physical endurance formed the backbone of the weekly challenges. Women were frequently required to maintain difficult positions for hours on end, perform intricate sequences of movements with precise timing, or complete repetitive tasks until exhaustion threatened to overwhelm them. These exercises were taxing not only for the body but for the mind. As the Baron scrutinized every movement for the slightest error, mistakes were punished, sometimes subtly, sometimes violently, reinforcing the lesson that precision and obedience were paramount. The physical strain was compounded by mental fatigue, as the women had to remain alert to the Baron's reactions, anticipate changes in rules, and adjust strategies instantaneously. Mental acuity was equally essential. The Baron often devised tasks that required concentration, problem-solving, and careful interpretation of instructions. Commands could be deliberately ambiguous, containing hidden rules or layered expectations that forced the women to think quickly and anticipate outcome. The ambiguity created a constant state of mental tension, as errors in judgment were met with punishment. The women learned to analyze every detail of the Baron's words, gestures, and expressions, searching for subtle hints that might reveal the intended meaning or expose the consequences of misinterpretation. Success depended not only on skill but on the ability to read both the situation and the Baron's mindset, creating a mental strain that was exhausting and unrelenting. Social dynamics played a critical role in the game. The women were rarely isolated. Their performance was constantly observed by peers as well as by the Baron himself. Rivalries emerged naturally, fostered by the competition for approval, survival, and relative standing in the eyes of their captors. Alliances formed, sometimes strategically, sometimes emotionally, but they were always fragile as trust was undermined by the Baron's manipulation. He subtly encouraged suspicion, jealousy, and competition, ensuring that the women were as concerned with monitoring one another as they were with meeting the demands of the game. Social tension became a force multiplier for the psychological pressure, amplifying fear and uncertainty in ways that extended far beyond individual tasks. The unpredictability of the Baron's methods was perhaps their most insidious aspect. Each week brought a new set of rules, a new sequence of challenges, and new punishments for mistakes that might have been overlooked previously. The women could never fully prepare, never anticipate with certainty, and never rely solely on experience from prior sessions. This unpredictability kept the women in a constant state of hypervigilance, their minds perpetually alert to subtle cues, shifts in tone, and minute gestures that could signal danger or indicate expectation. The mental and emotional toll of such continuous uncertainty was immense, leaving the women perpetually exhausted even before the physical demands of the game began. The Baron also leveraged humiliation as a form of control. Many challenges were designed to draw attention to failure, weakness, or vulnerability in front of peers. Public reprimands, verbal mockery, and enforced gestures of submission reinforced the social hierarchy within the hall, ensuring that no woman could escape scrutiny. Humiliation was not only punishment but a tool to erode confidence, weaken solidarity, and reinforce the psychological dominance of the Baron. The women learned that every movement, every expression, and every reaction could become a point of judgment, forcing them to cultivate composure and suppress instinctive responses to fear or discomfort. Psychological manipulation extended beyond immediate tasks. The Baron's interventions often created ethical dilemmas, forcing the women to make decisions that tested loyalty, honesty, and moral boundaries. Some tasks required prioritizing self-preservation over cooperation, while others compelled the women to act in ways that created tension or risk for their peers. These challenges forced internal conflict, making the women question their instincts and grapple with the moral weight of their choice. The Baron's design ensured that even when tasks were physically or mentally manageable, the emotional and ethical complexity amplified the psychological strain. Observation and surveillance were continuous. The Baron rarely left any action unexamined, noting subtle signs of hesitation, fear, or defiance. Even minor gestures, brief expressions, or fleeting reactions were significant in his calculation. The women learned that they were under constant scrutiny, not only during the explicit challenges, but in every aspect of their behavior within the hall. This awareness created a persistent pressure to self-monitor, to anticipate the Baron's interpretations, and to manage responses with painstaking care. The mental load of continuous self-regulation contributed to a sense of inescapable control and reinforced the power imbalance between captor and captives. Over time, the women developed strategies to cope with the relentless demands of the Baron's game. Some adopted mental routines to maintain focus, compartmentalizing fear and anxiety while performing tasks. Others observed patterns in the Baron's behavior, attempting to predict shifts in rules or the timing of punishment. A few relied on subtle alliances, sharing insights or signaling warnings without attracting attention, Yet, no strategy was entirely secure as the Baron's unpredictability ensured that each session could overturn previous assumptions. Adaptability became a crucial skill, but it carried its own psychological burden, as failure to adapt could mean immediate consequences. The cumulative impact of these weekly games extended beyond the hall. The women carried the mental and emotional weight of anticipation, memory, and fear into their daily lives. Sleep was often disrupted by anxiety over upcoming challenges. Conversations with peers were filtered through the lens of potential observation, and even mundane tasks were influenced by the conditioning of vigilance and caution imposed by the Baron. The psychological imprint of the games was profound, creating a pervasive awareness of vulnerability, a constant appraisal of self and others, and a relentless focus on survival in an environment where mastery was impossible. Fear, however, was only one component of the Baron's control. The women also experienced brief moments of relief or approval, small gestures that reinforced obedience and suggested the possibility of leniency or favor. These moments, however fleeting, were strategically employed to create a cycle of hope and tension, amplifying the psychological grip on the women. The unpredictability of approval meant that they could never relax fully, and the intermittent reinforcement served to heighten attention, conformity, and anxiety simultaneously. The Baron's mastery lay in his understanding of human psychology, using hope, fear, and social dynamics to maintain an unbroken cycle of control. The Baron's design ensured that every aspect of the game, physical challenges, mental strain, social competition, ethical dilemmas, and psychological manipulation interacted to create a totalizing system of domination. The women were constantly tested, observed, and manipulated, leaving little room for respite or certainty. Even success carried risks, as it could provoke scrutiny, envy, or new challenges, reinforcing the sense that survival depended on constant vigilance and adaptability. The interplay of strategy and unpredictability created a pressure cooker environment in which physical, mental, and emotional endurance were inseparable, and the Baron's absolute authority was continuously reinforced. The Baron's weekly game had a way of eroding the women's sense of autonomy, leaving them perpetually aware of their subjugation, while simultaneously forcing them to find ways to assert small measures of control over their own survival. Every session was carefully orchestrated to break down their independence, yet paradoxically, the challenges demanded that the women exercise judgment, strategy, and adaptability within the confines of their captivity. The Baron's brilliance and cruelty lay in this balance. He imposed absolute authority while creating circumstances that compelled the women to navigate complexity, to think and to act, even under extreme. In essence, the weekly game became a test, not only of obedience but of ingenuity, resilience, and mental resourcefulness under the strictest constraints. From the very first week, the women quickly realized that survival required more than merely following order. The Baron's challenges were layered with ambiguity, forcing them to interpret instructions that might have multiple meanings or hidden conditions. A command that appeared simple could have ramifications that were only revealed through subtle reactions from the Baron, or through the outcomes of their peers' performance. The women learned to scrutinize every detail. Tone of voice, gesture, timing, and sequence of words became critical indicators of expectation. Misinterpretation often led to punishment, reinforcing the necessity of keen observation and analytical thinking in addition to physical execution. Physical endurance remained central to the weekly ordeal. The Baron's tasks often involved maintaining strenuous positions for extended periods, performing intricate sequences of movement, or completing repetitive, exhausting actions under the weight of constant scrutiny. Fatigue compounded the difficulty of the challenges, as weakened muscles and drained energy reduced the ability to respond accurately to ambiguous instructions or sudden alterations in the rule. The women developed techniques to manage pain, conserve energy, and maximize efficiency, yet the unpredictability of the Baron's games meant that no amount of preparation could guarantee success. Physical resilience was thus inseparable from mental alertness, requiring the women to maintain composure even when exhaustion threatened to overwhelm them. Mental acuity was equally critical. Many tasks were designed to challenge the women's reasoning abilities, memory, and strategic thinking. They were forced to make rapid decisions with incomplete information, anticipate the Baron's expectations, and adjust behavior dynamically in response to subtle cues. The unpredictability of the challenges meant that learning from past experiences was helpful but never sufficient. The Baron frequently altered rules, introduced new elements, or manipulated variables in ways that rendered previous strategies ineffective. The women became adept at improvisation, analysis, and pattern recognition, yet the constant mental exertion took a cumulative toll, creating fatigue that was as psychological as it was physical. Social dynamics amplified the intensity of the weekly game. The women were rarely isolated. The Baron orchestrated situations in which observation by peers was unavoidable, fostering competition, jealousy, and rivalry. Some attempted to form alliances to navigate complex tasks, sharing insights or signaling subtle strategies without attracting the Baron's attention. Others were forced to prioritize self-preservation, seizing opportunities that risked harming or disadvantaging fellow slaves. The intricate interplay of collaboration, rivalry, and constant scrutiny added an additional layer of stress, as the women had to consider both the tasks themselves and the social implications of their action. The stakes were not only personally dangerous but could alter the social balance within the group, creating tension and mistrust that further magnified the psychological impact. The Baron's use of unpredictability was central to maintaining his control. The challenges changed weekly, sometimes subtly, sometimes dramatically, ensuring that the women could never develop a reliable routine or sense of mastery. Minor variations such as a shift in timing, a subtle change in sequence, or an unexpected twist transformed familiar tasks into new tests of endurance, comprehension, and adaptability. This unpredictability made every week a trial of vigilance, as the women were forced to anticipate not only the explicit rules, but the hidden intentions and possible deviations that could result in punishment. Over time, the mental load of constant anticipation and rapid adaptation created chronic stress, leaving the women psychologically drained even before physical exertion began. The Baron's strategies often incorporated elements of moral and ethical complexity. Some tasks required the women to choose between competing priorities, forcing them to balance self-interest against cooperation, or to make decisions that could create risk for others. These moral dilemmas created internal conflict, amplifying anxiety and uncertainty. The Baron observed not only the outcomes of these choices but also the decision-making processes themselves, using them to assess character, adaptability, and the capacity for control under pressure. The ethical component of the games ensured that the women were challenged on multiple levels simultaneously: physically, mentally, socially, and morally, creating a holistic form of psychological domination. Observation and surveillance were constant. The Baron rarely missed a detail, noting hesitation, minor errors, subtle gestures, or even fleeting expressions. The women quickly understood that their safety depended on regulating behavior, maintaining composure, and anticipating potential interpretations of their actions. The constant monitoring reinforced the pervasiveness of the Baron's control, as even minor lapses could be magnified and punished. The women's self-awareness became nearly obsessive, with every movement, glance, and expression filtered through the lens of possible judgment. The Baron's influence extended beyond direct interaction, shaping behavior, perception, and thought patterns in a near-continuous feedback loop of control and observation. Fatigue and exhaustion compounded the psychological burden. Physical strain, cognitive demands, and social tension converged, leaving the women mentally and emotionally taxed. Sleep and rest became fragmented by anticipation of the next challenge, memory of past failures, and the ongoing observation of both the Baron and their peers. The cumulative toll was profound, with each successive week compounding stress, reinforcing the perception of vulnerability, and eroding the women's sense of autonomy. Even brief moments of respite were tempered by the lingering presence of anticipation and anxiety, as the Baron's influence extended far beyond the immediate duration of the weekly game. Hope and intermittent approval were also carefully manipulated. Small gestures of praise, brief leniency, or recognition of effort created a delicate balance, offering just enough reward to reinforce attention, obedience, and continued effort. Yet this hope was always precarious, as success in one area could be followed immediately by a new, more challenging task. The cyclical pattern of reward and tension served to heighten engagement, sharpen vigilance, and maintain psychological dependence, ensuring that the women remained both fearful and attentive, fully enmeshed in the Baron's system of control. The Baron's games were therefore a comprehensive mechanism of domination, combining physical, mental, social, and psychological challenges into a seamless system designed to test every aspect of the women's capacities. Survival depended not only on endurance or obedience but on adaptability, perceptiveness, and the ability to navigate complex interpersonal and ethical dynamics under constant observation. The women's experience of the weekly game became all-encompassing, leaving lasting impressions on body, mind, and spirit. The intricate design of the challenges ensured that the Baron's authority remained unchallenged, as even the most competent, resilient, or resourceful participants were continuously reminded of their vulnerability, the unpredictability of the tasks, and the pervasive power wielded by their captors.
The Baron's weekly game reached its most intense and harrowing phase during the final segment, a period specifically designed to test endurance, obedience, and psychological resilience to their absolute limits. This portion of the game was deliberately unpredictable, combining the most physically taxing exercises with complex mental challenges and social manipulations that ensured the women remained in a state of heightened anxiety and alertness. Every movement, expression, and decision was scrutinized, with even the smallest misstep potentially triggering punishment. The Baron's genius lay in his ability to maintain total control over every aspect of the environment, while compelling the women to expend not only physical energy but also mental and emotional reserves in navigating the challenges. By the time the women reached the final segment of the game, fatigue was already deeply entrenched. Hours of standing in strained positions, performing repetitive tasks or executing intricate sequences had left muscles aching, joints stiff and bodies trembling. The Baron's instructions often required movements that tested coordination under exhaustion, demanding precision in situations where errors were almost inevitable. Yet he did not allow for pause or rest. The mental awareness required to interpret ambiguous commands, anticipate the next directive, and monitor the behavior of peers was just as demanding as the physical execution. The combination of exhaustion, anxiety, and social tension ensured that the women were operating at the very edge of their capacity. The Baron frequently escalated difficulty during this phase, introducing unexpected changes in rules, additional tasks or sudden penalties designed to provoke error and reinforce fear. A slight misalignment in posture, a hesitation in movement, or a delayed response could trigger correction, sometimes severe, emphasizing that vigilance and obedience were non-negotiable. These shifts also tested adaptability, as the women had to adjust instantaneously to altered conditions without allowing their stress or frustration to interfere with performance. The constant introduction of unpredictability prevented routine from forming, ensuring that mastery was impossible and reinforcing the lesson that control over their own actions was always provisional and dependent on the Baron's approval. Mental acuity was heavily challenged during this final phase. The Baron frequently incorporated tasks that required rapid calculation, memory recall, or logical problem-solving under conditions of extreme physical and emotional strain. Ambiguous instructions demanded interpretation, while subtle cues from the Baron's demeanor had to be decoded to ensure compliance and avoid missteps. Even small errors in judgment could result in punishment, making careful observation and mental focus as critical as physical capability. The women learned to balance speed with accuracy, effort with caution, and observation with action, understanding that survival depended on navigating an intricate web of demands that encompassed both explicit tasks and implicit expectations. Social dynamics intensified in this final segment. The women were constantly aware of their peers, as performance was openly observed and often compared. Rivalries were heightened, alliances tested, and trust continuously challenged. A woman who faltered could become a target of scrutiny, jealousy, or blame, while those who excelled could attract both admiration and suspicion. The Baron subtly manipulated these interactions, encouraging tension and rivalry to ensure that the women's attention was divided between their own performance and the potential errors or successes of others. This social pressure compounded mental strain, as the women were required not only to complete the tasks but also to navigate a complex interpersonal environment where misjudgment could have consequences beyond the immediate scope of the exercise. The element of psychological manipulation reached its peak during this phase. The Baron often employed fear, anticipation, and intermittent reward to maintain control. Brief moments of approval, leniency, or recognition could be offered, but these were unpredictable and always followed by new, more challenging tasks. The resulting cycle of tension, relief, and renewed challenge ensured that the women remained hyper-aware, their emotional responses constantly engaged in an exhausting feedback loop. Even minor successes were never fully secure, as the Baron's attention could shift abruptly, introducing new expectations and reinforcing the precariousness of their position. Physical punishment, though often unpredictable, was strategically applied to reinforce obedience and highlight error. Bruises, welts, and marks of discipline were visible reminders of past failures, while the threat of additional punishment ensured that fear remained an ever-present motivator. The Baron's careful calibration of pain, reward, and observation ensured that the women's attention was fully directed toward compliance, anticipation, and adaptation. The physical consequences reinforced mental vigilance, creating a continuous interaction between body and mind that magnified the psychological impact of the final phase. The ethical and moral complexity of the tasks was particularly pronounced in this segment. The Baron frequently presented scenarios in which the women were forced to make difficult choices, balancing self-preservation against cooperation, loyalty, or empathy. These decisions carried both immediate and long-term consequences, as performance, perception by peers, and the Baron's judgment all interacted to determine outcome. The women experienced internal conflict, grappling with the tension between survival instincts and personal values, while simultaneously under the scrutiny of both their captor and fellow slave. The Baron's manipulation of morality and decision-making reinforced the multidimensional nature of his control, shaping behavior in ways that extended far beyond physical execution of tasks. Observation remained a constant tool of domination. The Baron's gaze, gestures, and subtle expressions were as instructive and threatening as any command. Women were forced to anticipate shifts in attention, interpret unspoken signals, and adjust behavior preemptively to avoid error. This continuous requirement for self-monitoring, combined with physical, mental, and social strain, created a pervasive sense of surveillance, leaving little room for relaxation or lapse. Every action, from posture to facial expression, became a point of potential evaluation, reinforcing the omnipresence of the Baron's control and the impossibility of achieving true autonomy. By the time the final tasks concluded, the women's cumulative exhaustion, physical, mental, emotional, and social, was profound. Sleep deprivation, physical fatigue, cognitive load, and ongoing psychological tension converged to produce a state of extreme vulnerability. Even those who performed admirably were affected, their bodies and minds bearing the marks of sustained exertion and stress. The final segment was therefore not only a measure of immediate performance but a test of resilience, endurance, and the capacity to continue functioning under pressure that left lasting impression. Yet even as the challenges ended, the consequences and anticipation of the next week's game ensured that the cycle of control remained unbroken. The women's experiences during the final segment reinforced the lessons of submission, adaptability, and vigilance, embedding the Baron's authority into their awareness. Physical marks, psychological tension, social rivalries, and moral compromises were all reminders of the pervasive and inescapable influence of the weekly game. The final phase was both a culmination of the week's challenges and a reinforcement of the continuous nature of the Baron's control, shaping behavior, perception, and social dynamics long after the immediate ordeal had ended. The Baron's orchestration of the final segment revealed the depth of his understanding of human endurance and psychology. By integrating physical, mental, social, and ethical challenges into a single intense sequence, he ensured that the women were tested in every conceivable dimension. The unpredictability, continuous observation, and strategic use of punishment and reward created a holistic system of domination in which survival required mastery of multiple skills. Simultaneously, the women emerged from each session altered, physically strained, mentally exhausted, emotionally taxed, and socially vigilant, bearing the cumulative effects of a system designed to maintain absolute control, while leaving enduring marks on body, mind, and spirit. The culmination of the Baron's weekly game was more than just a demonstration of cruelty. It was a masterclass in domination, a calculated orchestration of fear, endurance, and psychological manipulation. By the end of each cycle, the women were not only physically exhausted but mentally reshaped, their thoughts, behaviors, and perceptions irrevocably influenced by the relentless structure of control. The Baron's genius lay in the subtlety of his tyranny. He did not merely punish, he conditioned; he did not merely command, he orchestrated; and he did not merely observe, he rewired the very instincts of survival in those under his control. Every challenge, every manipulation, every unexpected twist reinforced the hierarchy he imposed, making it clear that power was absolute, and submission was not optional. It was the only path to survival. The psychological imprint of the games extended far beyond the hall, echoing in the women's interactions with each other, in their self-perception, and in their constant anticipation of what horrors or tests might come next. By blending physical exertion with mental strain, social tension, and moral ambiguity, the Baron created a system where every dimension of human experience was harnessed to reinforce his dominance. Yet in the very act of imposing absolute control, the Baron inadvertently revealed the resilience, adaptability, and ingenuity of the human spirit. The women, though bound and tested, learned to observe, strategize, and endure in ways that transcended mere obedience. Each moment of triumph, however small, each fleeting insight into the Baron's methods, and each instance of subtle navigation of his cruel designs, became a testament to survival under impossible conditions. The games, in their cruelty, exposed not only the depths of the Baron's manipulation but also the extraordinary capacity for endurance, adaptation, and psychological survival within those he sought to dominate. Ultimately, the Baron's weekly game was a chilling exploration of power, control, and human resilience, a relentless cycle that left visible and invisible scars, reshaped behavior, and left all who witnessed or endured it irrevocably changed. It was a system where fear, observation, and manipulation intertwined so completely that escape from their influence was impossible, and yet within the darkness of oppression, flickers of ingenuity, awareness, and human survival persisted, quietly defying the very mechanisms designed to break